BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. On this episode of Zodiac Monday, I will be joined later by Vincent McConnell of the channel New Cokes 2024 to talk about all things Zodiac, but I wanted to go over a couple pieces of Zodiac killer news first. And the top story of the day does not need much of an introduction. The Netflix docuseries This Is the Zodiac Speaking is now available. And this is a 3-episode series that goes over two major aspects of the Zodiac Killer mystery. The first is a re-examination of Arthur Lee Allen, who still is the prime suspect in the Zodiac Killer case, and not only that, he's the only suspect to have been publicly named by law enforcement. And the second is hearing the stories of 3 children who knew him personally, Dave, Connie, and Don Seawater, who are referred to as the Seawaters for simplicity's sake. And we will be doing an extended discussion about the Netflix docuseries This Is the Zodiac Speaking on the channel Mysteries with Mr. Belgique. There will be a new episode of the panel discussion show over there, and that will be coming out later today, where we talk about the documentary in depth. And Mysteries with Mr. Belgique is hosted by Jerome Hulot, and he was the most recent guest on Planet X Filmworks for the Zodiac Files. That's an interview series that is hosted by Ross Geraci. And there's also a new episode of the Zodcast, where Drew Beeson responded to the documentary This Is the Zodiac Speaking, and I particularly liked his discussion on a different piece of Zodiac Killer news. There was an article from the Cinemaholic that came out in 2024 that was talking about a friend of Arthur Lee Allen, Donald Lee Cheney, who is Drew Beeson's suspect in the Zodiac Killer mystery. But as you see, there's also news about Don Cheney coming out in 2024, and I would like to give a shout out to George Barwood, who runs the WordPress Ed Edwards Serial Killer.wordpress.com, which has a lot of info about Ed Edwards as a Zodiac Killer suspect to go in a different direction. And I would like to give one more shout out to Nikki B, who has been exploring a new suspect in the Cheri Jo Bates case. Nikki B might be a name that some of you would recognize if you follow the D.B. Cooper mystery, but he is now exploring all things Zodiac as well as the murder of Cheri Jo Bates from 1966. And I would also want to remind you guys that some ways that you can help out Black Box Online Radio are by hitting the like button and subscribing. That's great for the channel, but you can also go through some of the links in the description box, and one of them is for buymeacoffee.com. Buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnid88 allows you to make a donation or a contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. And our shout-outs this week are going to Batman66, River Prawn Pottery, CZ Guy, and Mark Hewitt, author of the book Obsessed, My Relentless Pursuit of the Zodiac Killer. Before I bring Vincent on, I want to go over some basic info about Arthur Lee Allen, and this is the profile from ZodiacKiller.com. Arthur Lee Allen is the prime suspect in the Zodiac Killer case. He was born on December 18th of 1933 in Hawaii. Then he moved to California. Arthur Lee Allen graduated from Vallejo High School in 1950, and it is suspected that the Zodiac had very close ties to Vallejo. From 1948 to 1957, Allen attended Vallejo College, majoring in liberal arts. He received his associate's degree in 1957. 1948 to 1957. Sounds like there were a couple interludes there. From 1951 to 1952, Allen worked as a lifeguard at the Plunge in Vallejo. In 1953, Allen worked as a sailmaker at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in Vallejo, California. And some things that you will see in the documentary This Is the Zodiac Speaking, if you choose to watch that, are that Arthur Lee Allen was famously a very good diver, and they do show him diving, but also he was a very skilled sailor, and the Seawaters tell the stories of him on the sailboat and so on. From 1954 to 1960, Allen attended Cal Poly State College in San Luis, California, majoring in elementary education, receiving a bachelor's in 1960. In 1957, Allen enlisted in the U.S. Navy, and the Zodiac was thought to have an affiliation with the military, most likely the Navy. And ultimately, I do agree with this. In terms of the Zodiac's military involvement, I would say Navy, Air Force, then anything else would be a tie, like Army, Marine Corps. But a lot of people believe that the Zodiac killer was ex-military. On June 15th of 1958, Allen was arrested by the Vallejo Police Department for disturbing the peace as the result of an altercation with an acquaintance named Ralph Spinelli. And this is one that was covered in the 2007 documentary. But anyway, December of 1958, Allen was discharged from the Navy, and there's a widely held belief out there that Arthur Lee Allen was given a dishonorable discharge, but according to the book The Allen Files by John Bowman, Arthur Lee Allen actually received an honorable discharge from the Navy. That isn't simply something that John Bowman is giving us an opinion or a belief. He is sharing the documents. If you ever do read The Allen Files by John Bowman, it is just the primary source documents about Arthur Lee Allen's life, and it shows that he was given an honorable discharge. But from 1966 to 1968, Allen taught at Valley Springs Elementary School in California. His teaching career ended when he was fired for molesting a student. And they will discuss lots of this stuff in This is the Zodiac Speaking. In January of 1969, Allen allegedly confided in a friend named Don Cheney that he intended to kill couples at random, threaten school children, and write taunting letters to the police and call himself Zodiac. Now, I'm glad it says allegedly, because we don't know if that conversation actually happened. Now, we are going to jump ahead to July of 1969. Shortly after the murder of the second Zodiac killer victim, Darlene Ferrin, a relative of the victim informed investigators that Darlene had some sort of relationship with a man named Lee. Now, Arthur Lee Allen isn't the only suspect in the Zodiac killer mystery to have some type of Lee in his name. But I really want to jump ahead to some of the more pressing things about Arthur Lee Allen, because we're going to go to September 27th of 1974. Arthur Lee Allen was arrested by the Sonoma County Sheriff's Department on a charge of child molestation. Now, the Zodiac killer had written a couple times in 1974, breaking a 2.5-year silence. However, no authentic Zodiac killer letters were received after Allen's arrest. And the first one came in January of 1974. That would be the Exorcist letter. And then ultimately, Allen is sent to Atascadero State Hospital in 1975, and on January 3rd of 1978, let's go to August 31st, 1977, Allen completed his sentence and was released from Atascadero. Then on January 3rd of 78, he was hired as a fleet mechanic by Benicia Import Auto Service. And it seems like Arthur Lee Allen really never had a solid career, and he was bouncing around a lot between different occupations. But ultimately, he would go on to pass away on August 26th of 1992, and he died of natural causes at age 58. He had been suffering from diabetes, heart problems, and many other health issues. So those are some basic things about Arthur Lee Allen as, just his life. I was about to say as a Zodiac killer suspect, but those would mostly pertain to his life and behaviors. And I have several episodes about Arthur Lee Allen here on this channel that I invite you guys to check out. And we'll be doing a larger episode on the panel discussion show on Mysteries with Mr. Belzig if you'd like to hear more about the documentary. And right now, I will welcome Vincent McConnell to the program. This week on Zodiac Monday, I have the pleasure of being joined by Vincent McConnell, someone who has taken the Zodiac Killer mystery by storm and has made a very large impact in the discussions that we've been having. Vincent, are you with me?
Yes, I am.
And Vincent is the host of the YouTube channel New Cokes 2024. And Vincent, would you like to tell us what made you first curious about the Zodiac Killer mystery years ago?
I was always into document crafting and doing weird kind of word processor projects. And so I remember around the time I got involved was right when Paul Doerr was coming out on Reddit and talk about Paul Doerr and stuff. And I commented to someone on Reddit and looking at the circumstantial evidence and their coincidences, whatever they had. And I was like, oh, it must be this guy. It's so obvious. And the person replied and said, obviously, you haven't looked into this case very much. There's about 100 other people that have more compelling coincidences. So I started going down the little rabbit hole there. I think I found Interview with the Experts very, very early. And then, of course, your channel. And it's funny, I've been listening to Black Box Online Radio and all your work for like years. So now to actually be in the call, it's like interesting. But it's just the nature of the unsolved mystery of it. I cycled through the usual sort of suspects and people of interest until I just realized, like, unless we have something concrete, even if we have a pretty compelling case against someone, we really don't have proof. And I've been trying to bring a lot of science to this scene and encourage things like experiments and objective thinking for people. But it's just a little murder mystery.
Now, the Zodiac Killer was a serial killer who operated in California in 1968 and 69. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. But Vincent, who was the Zodiac Killer?
Well, we really don't know. I think that there are some very, very interesting and compelling facts about certain people. I know the SFPD has always really tightly looked at Arthur Lee Allen. I personally have not seen anything concrete or scientific to rule him out definitively. But I mean, you're looking at a massive population in California. You're looking at very little forensic evidence. As far as we know, there's really no DNA. And of course, we don't really know what the SFPD is holding back. So I think to really be fair is scientifically and objectively, we really don't know.
I'm a little bit surprised to hear that from you because when I watch your videos, and I've seen almost every video you've posted on New Cokes 2024, I would have thought that Arthur Lee Allen was your suspect, but would you say he's not?
I would say he's definitely not been ruled out. I think there are very serious things that need to either be explained or should be looked at in terms of Allen. But, if someone says who was the Zodiac Killer, for me to go on record and say it was Allen, that kind of goes against a lot of the objective fairness that I try to bring to this case. But I am a big Allen researcher. I like to discuss him a lot because I think of all the people, he's definitely the most interesting to look at. And until I see something that scientifically proves, and that's a strong word, of course, proof, that he's not the Zodiac, I definitely wouldn't just say, oh, it can't be him.
Okay, but Arthur Lee Allen is a suspect that's come under a lot of scrutiny and examinations, and he is perhaps the most famous, most widely discussed Zodiac Killer suspect. However, for the listeners of Black Box Online Radio on Zodiac Monday, would you like to give us your introduction as to who was Arthur Lee Allen?
Arthur Lee Allen was a disgraced and discredited or otherwise disreputable school teacher who was caught on a number of occasions doing very inappropriate things towards children, presumably inside and outside of work. He was a man who lived in Vallejo, had some trailers in Santa Rosa and other places. One thing is, like, it's hard to know how much of what or exactly what points of Robert Graysmith's works are true, but I definitely learned a lot about Allen from Robert Graysmith. And of course, he's a very, very dark seeming individual. In 1991, they pulled a number of bombs in various states of construction from underneath a crawl space in his house. He has a drawer full of guns. And of course, there's the whole laundry list of coincidences that people like to bring up with Allen. But I would say he is a very malevolent offender from the Vallejo area that just kept getting fired as a school teacher, kept getting, sort of exiled from society amongst his social peers and so forth. And then went on the rest of his life to angrily rant and rave at the police and everybody else for insinuating he may have been the Zodiac Killer.
Now, you just mentioned some things about how you haven't seen anything that rules Arthur Lee Allen out, but some people are going to do a few Google searches, and they might find some things on the internet, such as Arthur Lee Allen's DNA didn't match, Arthur Lee Allen's fingerprints didn't match, and his palm print didn't match. And by palm print, they mean what's called writer's palm, the side palm print that's pressed against the paper when someone would write a letter. And, I mean, you've heard all of this stuff before. Is that not enough to rule Arthur Lee Allen out?
No, I don't think we conclusively have the Zodiac Killer's DNA. I know they developed a so-called partial profile from 2002. There's been enough reasonable doubt as to whether or not that profile was developed from a sample that came from the inside or outside of a stamp. And I think that you're hearing kind of the opinions of people who will just Google search something and say, oh, Google told me he's ruled out. But meanwhile, they've never looked at those DNA profiles. They've never looked at the handprints or the fingerprints for themselves. Um, and then also the writer's palm print's been an interesting thing because when I first discovered it, it was definitely the closest thing that I would consider to having the potential to rule Allen out. But we have to remember the source from which it comes. It comes from the Exorcist letter, which was written in 1974. The Exorcist letter is a one-page letter that's pretty much, 2 or 3 sentences. It's less than a paragraph. A little goofy quote from the Mikado, and then a little cipher symbol glyph. And I tend to wonder if the Zodiac is supposedly leaving this writer's palm print on a single page letter, then why, to my knowledge, has this never happened before, when we have the bus bomb letter, which is 6 pages, the Little List letter, which is 9 pages, the debut letter, which is 3 pages, and then the 3-part 408 letter, which gives you an additional, 6 pages with cipher letter, cipher letter, cipher letter. And so for the Exorcist letter to be the first and only time that the Zodiac appears to have left a writer's palm print really makes you wonder. And it definitely makes you wonder because the fact that the letter was written in 1974. This would mean that not only Allen or somebody would have had time to figure out a way to make a fake palm print if they were indeed the Zodiac Killer, or it also makes you wonder why, for an offender who has already committed this prolific crime spree and, by all logical indications, probably would have gotten better at counterforensics over time, suddenly leaves a writer's palm print on a one-page letter when he had never done so before. I don't think it's impossible to forge a writer's palm print. I haven't personally conducted the experiments to prove that could be done. But I would say to use that one thing to rule somebody out when there are a number of other things that should be explained or looked at also, is a little hasty. And part of the problem is I think that people have a suspect or they have an agenda or an idea to push, and they're just going to argue very loudly about anyone that seems to be gathering attention as a Zodiac Killer suspect in order to suit their narrative. And so these kinds of things are very sketchy. Most of them are your average true crime hobbyist on Reddit, who has never actually looked at the prints. I took a look at some of the patent prints from the Paul Stine homicide scene, and I was not able to scientifically or conclusively prove or match those prints to Allen's. I saw a number of very interesting or curious things in those prints, but nothing that I would say, I should announce that the case has been solved. And the FBI appears to have concluded this too, because when they looked at those prints, they deemed their results inconclusive. And people have kind of misinterpreted this to mean it doesn't match, when in fact inconclusive means we really don't know or can't tell. And that's probably due to the quality of those Steinkamp prints.
But Vincent, there is another person who's heavily connected to Arthur Lee Allen, and his name is Donald Lee Cheney. And you've talked a lot about him on your YouTube channel. And a lot of what we hear and learn about Arthur Lee Allen comes from these stories that Donald Lee Cheney would tell. Is Donald Lee Cheney a truth teller? Is he a liar? Was he the Zodiac Killer himself? Is he somewhere in the middle of this epicenter? What about him?
Don Cheney is definitely what appears to be a liar. I don't really believe his stories. I think they're definitely very fanciful and that they changed over time. But to jump to the conclusion that because someone lied to the police, they must be the terrorist is, I think, a little bit quick and impulsive in its interpretations. I've before hypothesized another alternative solution with the Don Cheney thing, where I said, is it possible that Don Cheney initially approached the Pomona Police Department and told them everything that he actually knew about Allen, and at which point they brushed him off. He then, retreated, whatever, came back home and kind of thought this over, maybe with Sandy Panzarella, maybe with himself. And then either the two of them or just Chaney decided that in order to be taken seriously, in order for the police to look at Alan, who Chaney maybe believed was Zodiac, they would need to embellish these stories. And so by embellishing the stories, then they could get the SFPD to look closer, at which point they might hope the SFPD would find something. And I don't think that I have proof that this happened, but to say, oh, Don Chaney lied to the cops, therefore he's the Zodiac, is definitely a little bit faulty in my opinion. So some people have pointed to the idea that his family's names appear in the letters and ciphers, such as Paradise or Fry Night. These claims, too, are just one interpretation. I also would like to suggest an interpretation that maybe the Zodiac Killer knew who Chaney was and was putting his family's names into the letters and ciphers to either scare him or send a message to him. And although we don't have proof of this hypothesis or that hypothesis, I tend to think that this is a slightly more innocent and logical approach than going, he lied to the cops, he must be the Zodiac.
And I would like to remind everybody that I'm talking to Vincent McConnell of the New Coast 2024 channel, which you can find here on YouTube and listen for free. And you're listening to Zodiac Monday with me, Ned Dahan, Black Box Ned. And you can hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along with all of these Zodiac Killer episodes. And if you guys have any ideas for future episodes of Black Box Online Radio, future episodes of Zodiac Monday, you can drop them in the comment section down below. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And of course, I'm on Facebook, Ned Dahan, Black Box Online Radio, Instagram, BlackBoxNed88. You guys know where to find the stuff. So back to you, Vincent. You must know that there's a book out there called Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer, and it's written by Drew Beeson. He hosts the show The Zodcast, and his Zodiac Killer is suspect is Don Chaney. And you brought up one strike against Don. I would actually say you brought up two big strikes against Don Chaney being the Zodiac Killer right now. The first was that just because he lied to the police doesn't mean that he was the Zodiac. And the second was that there are names from Don Chaney's family, Paradise, and the other one is Friar. But as you said, Fry Night is what the Zodiac used in the letters. And there could be another explanation. Now, firstly, you seem like you followed the Zodcast to a certain extent. Is there anything else that would go against Don Chaney being the Zodiac Killer other than those 2 points?
It's so hard to say because, I mean, yes, you could. That's tricky. I mean, to really conclusively declare like what indicates that he's not the Zodiac is not so easy. Of course, his geographic position, he had long since moved down south, at least by several hundred miles, as far as I know, by the initiation of those crimes. I also don't necessarily think it would be wise if you were the Zodiac Killer to approach the police and start lying about who the Zodiac Killer was. It would just be a very precarious position. And, to be honest, when I look at Don Chaney in the interviews and kind of assess the situation, I see a creepy, kind of weird guy just subjectively. But I don't really see the kind of sinister man that put a .22 caliber pistol to David Faraday and shot him in the head. But Drew's I bought that book. And I think that it's important to not look at a situation of somebody lying to the cops and be so quick to draw such monumental conclusions. It would be a bit like trying to say, what are there any indicators that Ross Sullivan or somebody, maybe that's not a good example, but Richard Gaikowski or something. I mean, can you give me a good example of why Richard Gaikowski is not the Zodiac? And we don't know these people's positions at all times. We don't really have the forensics that I think would be necessary to declare something like that. But I definitely think there are more innocent and more reasonable hypotheses to draw before we start saying he lied to the cops, he must be the Zodiac.
Okay, Vincent, you just brought up the Lake Herman Road murders, which occurred on December 20th of 1968, saying that you didn't think that Chaney would hold the gun to David Faraday's head. Now, this question is two-part. I mean, it's both going in the same direction, though. And that is that, do you believe that the first Zodiac crime was at Lake Herman Road, or when it was the first Zodiac crime, in your opinion?
Yeah, I believe only the canonical crimes are Zodiac. Main reason I'd say that is, well, I got a couple reasons I'd say that. First, really, is I do believe that the terrorist's signature is to gain recognition for his murders. So I'm not one to suggest too much that Zodiac was out on his own time going around being a sadistic murderer like somebody like D'Angelo was in the Golden State Killer case or whatever. I also cite the car door at Lake Berryessa, which lists the timestamp of the Vallejo or the Lake Herman Road murders as the first in the sequence of crimes. I also refer to what I believe is the bus bomb letter on the back of the final page that says, to prove that I'm the Zodiac, ask the Vallejo cop about my electric gun sight, which I used to start my collection of slaves. And I just don't see too many indicators that we can conclusively say that there are earlier or later crimes by the Zodiac. It's possible, but so far I don't see anything that I would strongly say this is a Zodiac killer crime.
Okay, then I have a very different type of question then. Let's say, if Arthur Lee Allen were the Zodiac killer, what would be the motive for somebody like Arthur Lee Allen to commit the crimes?
This is a fun one. There were a couple witnesses or individuals that came forward in the years following those murders to tell us some stories about Arthur Lee Allen. And one of those individuals was Ralph Spinelli. Ralph Spinelli, according to his account, claims that Lee Allen came to him some point before the Paul Stine murder on October 11th, 1969 in Presidio Heights, San Francisco, and pitched himself as a hitman for organized crime. When Spinelli brushed him off or otherwise called him, a lunatic or whatever he called him, Allen allegedly told him, I'll prove to you I'm the Zodiac. I'm going to do something, or I'm going to go kill a cab driver. There's been different accounts. And then you'll know it's me. And then, according to Spinelli, after the murder of Paul Stine, Allen came back to him and said, now do you believe me? And Spinelli allegedly replied that he did believe him. And I find this story to be very interesting for a couple reasons. The first is that I intuitively tend to lean towards Spinelli probably being truthful in that interview. And also that it would make sense. Because if you're a discredited or disgraced school teacher who wants to start getting paid to commit murder, and you don't really have criminal connections, but you might have some loose ties to a guy that was involved in organized crime years before, how else would you approach that person and prove to them that you're capable of committing murder as you suggest that you would be willing to do? Well, one of those ways would be to become a famous murderer. And so if Spinelli's telling the truth, I think his witness testimony is the most valuable because it may give us the motive in the Zodiac killer case.
Well, now wait a second, Vincent. You just talked about the Stine murder. That was the final Zodiac crime. Then what would we do with something like the Lake Herman Road murders, which happened roughly 10 months before the Stine murder? How does that fit into a motive in the narrative that you just established?
I suspect if that were Allen, which of course, I guess, we can't say, but this would be part of that building credibility, building reputation, because the Zodiac really didn't become all that famous until Paul Stine, though, of course, he had gotten some recognition before. But if you look at Lake Herman Road, nobody knows who did it until those letters start arriving to the Examiner, Chronicle, and Vallejo Times-Herald. Even with Blue Rock Springs, you have a mostly local phenomenon. This is a murderer running around Vallejo. Then you have Lake Berryessa, which he doesn't make much of a stir about, and I find that interesting too. And then you have Presidio Heights, where he could be attempting to catapult himself to stardom and a celebrity status, at which point he'll come to approach criminals or otherwise to say, hey, look, I've established my reputation. I'm a killer. You all know it. But this is very hypothetical because it all depends upon, if true, whether or not Ralph Spinelli is telling you the truth. And so people, I think, have to kind of decide for themselves based on that interview, is Spinelli lying or is he being truthful?
There are a lot of things that we can go through there, but We can also go through the Zodiac crimes one by one, and we just talked about the Lake Herman Road murders, December 20th of 1968. Now let's jump ahead to July 4th of 1969. There is something about Arthur Lee Allen that's widely discussed in the world of the Zodiac, and that is the connection to the victim, Darlene Ferrin, who was murdered at the Blue Rock Springs shooting. Vincent, do you believe that Arthur Lee Allen knew Darlene Ferrin personally?
Probably not very closely. I know there's been a lot of rumbling in the months and years following the shooting, especially before, this enigmatic domestic terrorist claimed responsibility for her murder, that police were kind of looking into her social network and getting an idea of who she knew, why someone might want to do this. I think that if Allen knew Darlene Ferrin, it would have most likely been in some kind of passing. I don't think they were closely connected. If they were, his name would have probably come up before it ended up coming up. But he lived close to where she worked. And if that phone call was in fact placed from the Tuolumne Springs phone booth, which has been the historical narrative, then that would have only been a 10 or 15-minute walking distance from Arthur Lee Allen's house at 32 Fresno Street, as far as I know.
Well, that answers one thing, but do you believe the stories that Darlene Ferrin had a stalker and there's this strange man that's following her, maybe even sending her suspicious packages? Or do you think those stories are fabricated?
It's so hard to tell. I lean towards no, just because I feel like it would have come up from more sources than Graysmith and Pam Huckabee and these people that were affiliated with Darlene Ferrin and around her. But if that were happening, of course, then we'd have to ask, what evidence do we have that packages were sent? Can we place Arthur Lee Allen amongst her social peers prior to her murder? And I think there's just a lot of unknowns there. And the biggest issue is that whole matter has been so cluttered and so fogged with information for 56 years at this point that it can be very difficult to sift through and say, okay, this is real. This was claimed by Pam Huckabee or others. And then who knows what's been made up at this point. So I haven't dug too deeply into that stuff just because it's very hard with the information that I've seen so far to conclusively decide that.
Okay, then, we've talked about Blue Rock Springs. Now we're going to move ahead to another Zodiac crime, and that is the Lake Berryessa stabbing, September 27th of 1969. This ultimately saw the death of Cecilia Shepard, who would pass away later in the hospital, and the stabbing of Brian Hartnell, who would survive. Now, this is very different. The Zodiac killer is wearing a hooded costume. He has the Zodiac symbol on it. It's the black executioner style hood with the clip-on sunglasses. He's carrying a knife, and he committed the crime by knife as opposed to committing the crime by gun, like he had done with the two previous Zodiac attacks. First question, why change from a gun to a knife at Lake Berryessa?
Yeah, such a bizarre thing. There has been speculation that maybe he was trying to compete with Charles Manson and the Manson family in the press. There's been speculation that maybe he was just feeling out different ideas. There's been some talk about how this might be an escalation pattern. And of course, a lot of people wonder about that costume. I think there's a very practical explanation for that costume that I just don't ever really see talked about, is that if that crime is witnessed from a distant location, say maybe a bird watcher or a hunter using a scoped rifle, this would allow him to thwart witness identifications or descriptions, even if he had killed both people at the crime scene, but had been seen by someone that he didn't know. So the knife thing is really weird. It might have just been a publicity grabbing thing. Or it could be indicative of a deeper, sicker psychological desire in the killer's mind. And of course, I don't think we'll know until he's either identified or questioned or whatever eventually happens, if he's still alive, or if there's some kind of solution in the case. He might have just found that shooting people was not as fun as he wanted it to be, and he wanted to try something more graphic. I don't know.
I have a very big question for you about the Lake Berryessa stabbing. And it relates to something that Sharon Hagen said at one of the documentaries from 2007, and that is that the Zodiac killer was not a sadist. But I always point to the Lake Berryessa stabbing where he stabbed Brian Hartnell in the back at least 6 times, stabbed Cecilia Shepard at least 10 times, and it appears that she was cut additional times, such as superficial lacerations, defensive wounds, and so on. Was the Zodiac Killer a sadist, in your opinion?
I think there's definitely something to be said about the psychology of a person who chooses to gain recognition through murder on human beings. Um, whether or not what I guess defines a sadist is like he's getting a sexual thrill from harming people, I don't know. But I don't think that your average healthy, logical, or rational, insane human being wakes up in the morning and decides to become a famous murderer.
Oh, yes, very good answer. But after the Blue Rock Springs shooting, we saw so many things. Number one, the Zodiac makes a phone call, sure. But then the Zodiac would go on to write multiple letters taking credit for the crimes, detailing them. He also detailed the Lake Herman Road murders in his first letter, even in August 4th, or what we call the August 4th letter, although there are a couple different dates, mailing date, receiving date, and the storage date. But he is also providing additional information about the good times that he had in Vallejo. Yet after the Lake Berryessa stabbing, the Zodiac makes a phone call, but he doesn't write a letter detailing the crimes. Why not?
Yeah, it's very curious. I think it was you that brought this up on the panel. I might be wrong, but you mentioned that, or somebody mentioned that it's as if he's trying to make a bigger stir in Presidio to perhaps distract attention away from Berryessa. Um, it's possible that he slipped up in some way there. Of course, coming up to the victims, interacting with them, having a conversation with them, being on the scene for a period of time, binding them with bindings, and then stabbing them, and really having that intimate physical interaction with the crime scene for pretty much the first time that we've seen. There's a possibility that he might have been concerned in some way, shape, or form and wanted to just draw our attention away from it or otherwise forget about it. It's possible that stabbing people was traumatic for him. I don't know, because again, we don't have his psychological makeup really all that well understood. But yeah, it's definitely really interesting that Zodiac was mostly silent aside from that car door writing about that crime.
And after the Stein murder, when the Zodiac Killer wrote that I am the murderer of the taxi driver and the kids in the North Bay area, do you believe that the North Bay area was referring to Lake Berryessa?
Maybe. I know that, but the Stein letter opens up, Dear Editor, this is the Zodiac speaking. I am the murderer of the taxi cab driver over by Washington Street and Maple Street last night. To prove this, here is a bloodstained piece of his shirt. I don't know where exactly. I guess maybe it's right after that he said, I'm also the man who did in those people in the North Bay area.
Yes.
This very vaguely and very vastly can be interpreted different ways. I'm from Southern California. I've never been up there. I'd like to eventually go up there and walk these crime scenes to see if it gives me any greater intuitive understanding of them. But he might have just been referring to the general, Bay Area when he said that.
Yes, absolutely. That could also just refer to Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, and Lake Berryessa all in one, depending on what you mean by the North Bay area. However, prior to the Lake Berryessa stabbing, we have a very suspicious individual who was lurking around. He is staring at three college girls while they're sunbathing for an extended period of time. They were bothered by him. And there's a composite sketch of this individual, and he has since been labeled as the Lake Berryessa voyeur. Now, if Arthur Lee Allen were the Zodiac Killer, hypothetically speaking, do you think the Lake Berryessa voyeur was Arthur Lee Allen?
I guess a better question there is the Lake Berryessa voyeur the Zodiac Killer? Because I do believe that that's the same offender that stabbed Cecilia and Shepard and Brian Hartnell there. I tend to think that these crimes require a great deal of prowling and stalking before the commission of the crimes. And I find it very, very interesting that a man was seen stalking these women prior to that assault in just the next, I guess they're like a little alcove or some kind of little recession in the lake geography there. And people have used both the voyeur sketch and some of the witness description from Brian Hartnell to rule Arthur Lee Allen out. But I want to draw everybody's attention to, and I won't go too deeply into this, but it's just good to cite it. the composite sketches that we received of the East Area Rapist original Night Stalker from that particular case, because the vast majority of those sketches come from suspicious individuals that were seen prior to or after the perpetration of these crimes. And so the Zodiac, if he's a smart guy, would probably recognize that if he's going to be seen, if he's going to be described and composite sketched and so forth, that might very well have happened, not necessarily just during the murder or the attempted murders, but in the hours preceding that stabbing, and then in the period of time following that escape. So if he were a smart man, he probably would have been in disguise while prowling and stalking. But if he's walking around in an executioner's costume, this would draw very, very unsavory attention to him and probably result in the police response before he could even kill anybody. So I do think the voyeur was the Zodiac, and I would not at all rule out the possibility that the offender at that crime scene was wearing a disguise of some kind, such as a wig or a hairpiece or something.
Okay, now we've already mentioned the book Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer by Drew Beeson, and in that book, he lays out an argument about why he thinks it would be very impractical for the Zodiac Killer to wear the wig at Lake Berryessa. Because, as I'm sure you wouldn't even dispute, Arthur Lee Allen was balding at the time, even in 1969. And what Drew has laid out in the book Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer is, it would be impractical to wear a wig because the Zodiac would then go on to put the executioner's hood costume over the wig, and a wig could become dislodged. It could, if it fell forward, it could block his vision, and it could cause unforeseen problems while it's underneath a hood. Furthermore, it's not necessary to wear a wig underneath an executioner's hood if he's going to be completely concealing his face and the entirety of his head. But I think that if you were to say Arthur Lee Allen was a strong Zodiac suspect, you'd have to say that he was wearing a wig at Lake Berryessa, because Cecilia Shepard also reported seeing the Zodiac with a full head of dark-colored hair. And what's your take on that?
Two good points on that. The first is that this is based upon Drew Beeson's opinion as to whether or not he thinks a wig would have been practical under the hood there. I believe that there are potentially hypothetical scenarios where a wig would not become dislodged. One of them might be using some kind of adhesive. The other might be that the mask or some instrument or implement of some sort was put in place so as to make it a physical impossibility for the wig to descend below the crown line of the head, regardless of what happened. I've made the rather weak comparison, but otherwise it's illustrative, of something like a laboratory glassware ring stand, where if you attempt to drop a piece of glassware through that ring, eventually it makes it impossible for the glassware to fall away through the ring. Now, this, of course, is more fabric and materials based, but I don't think that we can say that there isn't something Zodiac could have done to make it so that wig simply couldn't come dislodged. And we also have to remember that this thing in the movie where Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard stand up and have a face-to-face with Zodiac doesn't appear to be actually what happened, because according to Tom Voigt, when Brian Hartnell attempted to stand up, the Zodiac Killer ordered him down, and most of that interaction that occurs in the movie was actually done while both victims were still laying on the blanket. And so the idea that, somehow Brian Hartnell is going to overpower him or create some sort of struggle where the wig can become dislodged not only relies on the idea that it's a very loose fitting or cheap wig, but it also relies on the idea that there was much of an opportunity for Hartnell to get in this kind of struggle with Zodiac. So to say he's ruled out based on that, I think just really depends upon the possibility that this wig could fall off. Now, as to the necessity of it, if the Zodiac has a wig on, then he puts his hood on. There's never a time period where he is seen with the wig off as he's transitioning to the hood. He has to know that there's every real possibility that every aspect of his actions, both approaching the crime scene, leaving the crime scene, and prowling the area before or after perpetration, could be witnessed from a long-range witness. So for him to take that wig off, then put the hood on, now he's defeated the entire purpose of wearing a wig, which would be, hypothetically, to rule a bald man out. And this worked very effectively because, potentially, because when Sergeant John Lynch approached Arthur Lee Allen in 1969, he, within 1.5 sentences, basically rules Allen out as being the offender because Mr. Allen was bald, he says. And so the wig would accomplish this. And I think it's important to Zodiac never to take that wig off at any point while he's getting ready for or departing that crime scene.
You just mentioned something that was also important in the Zodiac killer's activities at Lake Berryessa, and that is that he approaches Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, and he's talking to them while they're on the picnic blanket, and as you said, he orders Brian Hartnell down. But the Zodiac killer is telling this wild story about how he escaped from prison and he killed a prison guard in Montana, possibly near Deer Lodge prison in Montana, if that's what he said. And he said he just wants your money. He's just trying to get to Mexico. And I have a two-part question for you. Number one, do you think the Zodiac was telling the truth? And the second part is, do you think that this is some type of window into the Zodiac's world, or are there certain clues or pieces of information that we can learn about the Zodiac killer from this wild story that he told?
I can't imagine approaching a murder victim or a potential murder victim and then giving them any accurate information about your personal life and previous activities. I like to use these, cite the example of D'Angelo a lot, though I know that's not the most scientific way to do it. But he was a good example of someone who repeatedly, over and over again, at numerous crime scenes, made passing remarks or other little just conversation pieces that were entirely designed to throw off the police when they came to question the witnesses. And the Deer Lodge thing appears to have been a suggested answer from the police when they were questioning Brian Hartnell in the hospital, because Brian Hartnell himself didn't say Deer Lodge, Montana. It was kind of hinted towards him before we got him to say, yeah, maybe that was it. And I like Hartnell because by and large, he's been a very objective and seemingly level-headed guy in telling his account of these stories. I think it's dangerous to potentially feed Zodiac's misdirection by taking anything he says at face value and then going off on investigative routes. I don't see a reason why you would approach potential murder victims and tell them you broke out of prison and killed a guard. That seems very careless. And if he was the kind of guy who did that kind of thing, I really don't think he would have got away with this for 56 years.
But the Zodiac killer did wear this elaborate hooded costume that had the executioner-style hood. It has the Zodiac symbol on it. He has the clip-on sunglasses. He has his gun, his knife, and pre-cut lengths of rope. But if he had murdered both Brian and Cecilia, and pending that no one saw him from a distance, as you said, with binoculars or a scope or something, no one would know about it. What is your response to the people who say that the Zodiac killer wanted to keep at least one victim alive at Lake Berryessa to tell the story of the costume? Viable or not viable?
Probably not viable. Hartnell's injuries were extremely critical injuries. The blade missed his heart by fractions of an inch. And although Zodiac did not ensure their death, such as stabbing them in the brainstem or severing the carotid or jugular, he did make a very, powerful attempt to do some significant damage. He stabbed them in the torso, in the back. It would have been very difficult to inflict those kinds of wounds and not expect a very reasonable or likely possibility that both victims would be killed from those wounds.
All right, so this is the Lake Berryessa stabbing. Then we're going to go to the Stein murder. And we've talked a little bit about how and possibly why the Zodiac would commit the Stein murder, or if the suspect is Arthur Lee Allen, a motive for him to murder Paul Stein, the taxi driver. But the Zodiac leaves the scene of the Stein cab. And we were talking about this on the most recent panel discussion show, which everybody can hear on the channel Mysteries with Mr. Belchique. There's a weekly panel discussion show about the Zodiac killer with multiple participants. And the thing that I would like to ask you is, was the Zodiac killer really smart or really lucky not to get caught after the Stein murder?
I'd say both. He appears to be a fairly intelligent individual. I think that there are subtle indicators in the letters of someone with a pretty decent grasp of both public relations, theatrics. He appears to have been relatively decent at counterforensics for that time period. But I also think he got really lucky, because when he exited that cab and began his escape from the crime scene, the offender missed the police by only about a minute and a half or 2 minutes. And I think that this was enough of a close call where he probably would have been having some periods of very serious self-reflection about how much longer he could be getting away with this.
Very good answer. But you have done some work on your channel, New Cokes 2024, some independent forensic experiments looking at the prints after the Steincab, as well as the possibility that the Zodiac may have used airplane cement on his fingertips, as the Zodiac claimed he did in a letter. Would you like to tell us the story of how you conducted those experiments and what were your conclusions?
So I pretty much followed the description that Zodiac gives us, as limited as it was. What he says in the bus bomb letter is, contrary to what the police say, I have left no fingerprints behind me. In my killings, I use transparent fingertip guards. All it is 2 coats of airplane cement coated on my fingertips, quite unnoticeable and very effective. I went to Hobby Lobby and I provide the UPC number of the exact type of Rust-Oleum airplane cement that I bought. And I purchased some that was designed for wood and metal surfaces, going off of the logic that in 1969 you would have had a lot more wood and metal componentry for these types of things than you would have had plastic. I thought it was a more fair, material to use. But of course, we don't have too much details from Zodiac there. I would say that, yes, it is very unnoticeable. Pretty much all it is a subtle shine on the fingers that would go largely or entirely unnoticed by anyone who didn't know to look for it. And I also provided some test runs of patent fingerprints from that airplane cement being coated on my fingers. And what I found was not only were garbage quality prints of basically no evidentiary value left behind when I made those patent impressions, but also I found that they appear to look very curiously similar to the type of prints that were left at the Steincab. And one of the issues is that the fingerprints that have been released by the SFPD or otherwise brought to the public domain are very poor resolution quality. And it makes it really difficult to get a really nice scientific analysis of those. But I also found something that's a serious problem for this claim. And that is that if any of that glue flakes off of your fingers, which it will quite easily, you would have basically a perfect impression of the fingerprints left in those glue flakes. And so I'm really back and forth as to whether or not he would have done that. I definitely think Zodiac would have tested these kinds of things before just applying them and then running off and committing a murder. But he really had no way of being 100% sure that I can see so far to not lose one of those fingerprint caps in the cab somewhere. And of course, he didn't have time to dig through the cab too deeply to remove forensic evidence. And this would be potentially a very, very serious slip up if any of that glue flaking was found.
So does this mean that you don't believe the Zodiac killer when he said he put airplane cement on his fingertips to hide his fingerprints? You think that didn't happen?
It's so hard to tell. I knew some criminals that personally in my life told me about putting super glue on their fingers years before I knew about this crime spree. I know Ryan Burns on the DB Cooper Sleuth channel has talked about how we have Cooper's palm print, but none of his fingerprints. And so therefore he must have had some kind of implement here to disguise his fingerprints. And I also worry about the possibility of him, dropping these flakes of glue and how this could be basically get him caught. And he probably would have determined this during his own experiments. But at the same time, in looking at those prints, albeit they're poor quality that they are, it looks like there's something on those fingerprints, because either the latent or the patent impressions that are in the public domain seem to show what looks like a static television distortion. It doesn't really look like ridge detail, except for around the edges of the prints. So I really go back and forth, and it's one of those things in Zodiac that's just, I don't know. There seems to be indicators both for and against.
But when you did the experiment on New Cokes 2024, when you put the airplane cement or the adhesive on your fingertips, did it completely block out the fingerprints, or what was the result?
Largely, yeah. What you end up with is very, very subtle and very, very partial ridge detail around the edges of those latent print impressions. And if you take a look at the Steincab prints, you see what appears to be the same phenomenon too. So I don't know. It's really weird. I know I posted this on Tapatalk, and people kind of went back and forth about this, and that's Tom Voigt's Zodiac Killer forum. People said that the airplane cement used back then was of much higher quality. It would have never flaked off. But we're relying on the, I mean, he would have had to be playing gambles there with that. And so I really can't tell. I've been a large advocate of pushing for the SFPD to release more evidence for us. And if I can get some high quality prints, or if some high quality Steincab evidence can be released into the public domain, I think it would be largely advantageous to us in terms of having the community take a look at that fingerprint evidence for themselves.
All right, fascinating. But after the Stein murder, we have the Zodiac Killer walking down the street. And he is witnessed, actually at the Steincab, by Lindsay Robbins and Rebecca Robbins, and they went on to provide the details for the famous Zodiac Killer composite sketch with the glasses and the crew cut, maybe the most famous Zodiac Killer image. Now, you've talked a lot about Arthur Lee Allen as a Zodiac Killer suspect, but one point that I've always brought up is, maybe it was even one of my immediate reactions years ago, that Arthur Lee Allen doesn't seem to match the witness descriptions. He had a much bigger face, a very round face, whereas the composite sketch appears to have somewhat of a pointed chin, almost bony cheekbones. Arthur Lee Allen's face was very full. What would be your response to someone who says that Arthur Lee Allen does not match the Zodiac Killer witness descriptions?
I'm highly skeptical of the validity of that sketch. The thing is, with Lindsay and Robbins and Rebecca Robbins, I'm not really too convinced that they even got the best look at the offender. I think that they did get a look at the offender. But from that distance, with that lighting, under those conditions, under that stress, and just in the chaos of the present moment, I don't think we can rely too closely on that sketch as being a very accurate description of the offender's face. And of course, later on, and I think it was Rebecca Robbins met with police and amended the sketch and said, well, we don't like this first composite. We think that the offender looks heavier and older. And I think if you look between Presidio Heights Composite 1 and the Presidio Heights Composite Sketch Revised, it almost to me looks like it doesn't really necessarily reflect those adjusted inputs by Rebecca Robbins or whoever made those adjusted inputs. And if that's the case, for that second sketch to be signed off on again by the witness casts a serious amount of doubt on that witness's credibility to me as to how certain they are what they saw. I have some issues with the concrete or definitive interpretations that people have developed about that sketch. And of course, if you look at the Lake Berryessa Voyeur next to the Presidio Heights composite, you're essentially looking at two entirely different people. And so I wouldn't put too much stock in it. I think way too much attention is being paid to composite sketches when we should, in fact, be looking at more ballistics or more forensics, and maybe lobbying or otherwise encouraging law enforcement to release more evidence or more information for us.
Okay, but after the Stein murder, the Zodiac walks down the street, and he is witnessed, allegedly and reportedly, by officers Falcon Zelms, Donald Falk and Eric Zelms. Do you believe that Officer Donald Falk spoke to the Zodiac that night?
No. I think if he spoke to Zodiac, he would have probably noticed that the offender or the person he was speaking to had at least some amount of blood, either on his clothing, in his lap, on his hands, or something like that. And I also don't see in the timeline, though the interaction could have been very brief, I'm not sure. Falk claims that he didn't talk to the Zodiac. Zodiac claims he talked to him. It's a very weird situation, but I don't think that there was too much time for that to have happened. And I also think that if Falk had the clear, unobstructed and up close and personal interaction with Zodiac that history has sort of insinuated for us in some circles, he probably would have noticed something was up with that guy and then probably detained or arrested that individual.
Now, after the Stein murder, and after talking to Officer Donald Falk, or as you said, walking past Officer Falk, because you don't believe the Zodiac talked to him, what did the Zodiac do? Which direction did he go? Did he walk into a park nearby? Did he walk toward the houses? Did he have a different type of getaway plan? Feel free to speculate, theorize, and hypothesize as much as you want.
Well, some people have said that he jumped a small wall into the Presidio and made his escape that way. Some people have said that he had a car parked nearby on Jackson Street. Some people have speculated that he may have rented or otherwise had access to some sort of apartment or lair or hideaway in that area. The Zodiac claims that he was in the park. He provides some details as to the dog searching teams, the fire trucks with the lights and stuff like that in the bus bomb letter. So I do think that he was at least close enough to the crime scene to ascertain some information that he then relayed in the bus bomb letter as to the police response happening there. But it's hard to say for sure. He might have gone into the Presidio, but this would be very risky for him because that's a long trek. I don't know how big the Presidio is exactly. It would be unwise, I think, for Zodiac to have parked very far away. He might have had a car on the other side of the Presidio and escaped via the Golden Gate Bridge. Robert Graysmith claimed, and I've been recently kind of loud about this, that there was an apartment rented to an individual whose name and occupation in the Presidio was listed as Arthur Allen Student. If that's true, I believe that to be majorly significant. If it's not true, then I would really love to see that get debunked. But he definitely went from Cherry Street, Jackson Street, and then his whereabouts appear to be unknown from there.
All right, so I guess it's still part of the mystery.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked a lot about Arthur Lee Allen as a Zodiac killer suspect. However, there's a different type of theory out there that's put forward by Thomas Henry Horan, author of The Myth of the Zodiac Killer and the host of the Stones Unturned podcast. Thomas Horan is a supporter of the Zodiac hoax theory and the largest proponent, perhaps even the architect of the Zodiac hoax theory, the idea that there was not a single Zodiac killer, that these were unconnected crimes, that somebody wrote letters for taking credit for the crimes, and he made it appear as if though there was a single killer, but in reality, these were unconnected homicides. And you've made a couple YouTube videos talking about Thomas Henry Horan's observations. So I would just like to ask you to share with the listeners of Black Box Online Radio, what do you think about the Zodiac hoax theory?
It's a nifty little story. I think it's interesting and fun to play around with, but largely doesn't really stand up to scrutiny for many reasons. Of course, we have some forensic evidence included in the Stein letter and the Belli letter, which would be pieces of Paul Stein's shirt. And although Horan has an explanation for that, I think that explanation was derived based upon probably predetermined opinions or positions on things. And he also has to explain why the offender from Lake Berryessa and with his walk appears to line up with the offender exiting the Stein cab in some areas. So they've had to pick two crimes, so unsolved for 56 years, where there was a stocky offender who various behaviors surrounding the commission of the crimes. When I got interested in this case, I was interested in Horan's version of events too, because I've always been interested in these conspiracy theories and CIA plot and all this stuff. But with Horan, the longer that I've listened to him, the more I've started to realize that he just draws the weirdest conclusions and ties things together that are very, very questionable. For example, he likes to refer to Betty Lou Jensen and I don't know if it's David Faraday or somebody else having parents in the military. He calls them like spooks or spies or whatever. And this is an era where many, many people were in the military. So to look at Betty Lou Jensen's parents and say they have military service, they worked on, missiles or whatever they were doing, and then look at somebody else and say they've got parents in the military further conspiracy is largely absurd to me, and I think is indicative of kind of a pre-existing way of thinking. And then, of course, he talks about Paul Stine, and he said he's gone on record. I don't know if he's since amended this. I would kind of hope so, or if not, then I hope someone bring this to his attention. He says that Paul Stine was investigating the Visalia ransacker, but the problem is that Paul Stine died in 1969, and the Visalia ransacker wasn't active until like 1974. And so it's really impossible for Paul Stine to have been investigating Visalia ransacker cases. And I'd become alarmed by this because this is such a simply, obtainable set of data points here that I feel like he should have known that doesn't line up. I tried to bring this to his attention, I believe, in comments or in videos, and I saw him make the same mistake multiple times, including on an episode of the Zodcast with Drew Beeson.
Well, that's some very, very direct stuff about the Zodiac hoax theory, and I appreciate that. But you did just mention the Visalia ransacker. And that, of course, is the person who goes on to become the East Area Rapist, who goes on to become the Golden State Killer. And he is, of course, now labeled as Joseph DeAngelo. He has been identified. But there is a theory out there that Joseph DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, was also the Zodiac Killer, and they were one and the same, and he was indeed operating earlier than 1974. And what is your response to the Zodiac Golden State Killer connection?
When I first got into this case, I thought it was the most one of the most unlikely things I'd heard. Then later on, I realized that it's actually not quite as bad as I originally thought, but I also don't think it stands up to scrutiny. He would have been quite young at this time, and it doesn't appear to really line up with descriptions of Zodiac and aspects of the letters or his behavior that appear to be a slightly older, wiser man. And in 1972, in 1973, there was a series of crimes that are now attributed to, sort of prehistory events and the trajectory of the so-called Golden State Killer, called the Cordova Cat and the Exeter Ransacker. So if DeAngelo is the Zodiac, he's going from doing this highly publicized shooting and murder campaign that he's doing to then breaking into houses and stealing single earrings and doing other weird behaviors. He interacted with his victims far more. There is some interaction with Zodiac and Hartnell and Shepard at Lake Berryessa, but I think it pales in comparison to the type of behavior that we see from DeAngelo later on in the East Area Rapist series. It's very hard to tell, though.
But on your YouTube channel, New Hoax 2024, you have a lot to say about Paul Holes, one of the investigators in the Golden State Killer case. And would you like to share your thoughts about him?
He's so cool. I believe Paul Holes to be a national hero. I love the work that he did in identifying DeAngelo. I think he's a very well-spoken, fair-minded person who is bringing a sort of good philosophy and good objective crime scene analysis to the world. And I think he's a great natural homicide investigator. I bought his book, and he made a number of observations that were essentially invaluable and appear to have changed the nature of homicide investigation today. So I'm a huge fan of Paul's.
And the book you mentioned, was that Unmasked?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, yes. Now, we've talked a little bit about the Golden State Killer very briefly, but aside from Arthur Lee Allen, has there ever been a Zodiac suspect that got your attention when you thought, maybe this is the guy?
Don Chaney. Before I started really dissecting that situation, I was much more open to Don Chaney being Zodiac. And then as I kind of took a step back and tried to simmer my emotions down and things and try to look at it from different angles, it kind of began to occur to me that that's a possible solution, but it's also not the most accurate solution. And I recently brought up that there was some talk of whether or not the Zodiac Killer was a draftsman, which has been sort of talked about because, maybe because, I can't say this for sure, but I think people are trying to kind of link Zodiac's identity to Don Chaney. And for whatever reason, the Zodiac Killer appears to have been using water-soluble felt-tip pens, and a draftsman is much more likely, in my experience, to use an archival ink that would not dissolve in that way when anhydrine was fumed on the page. So I've kind of looked at a lot of people. I went pretty hard at Arthur Lee Allen. I don't think there's anything that so far has swayed me on that. But of course, if he's identified tomorrow and it turns out he's not Arthur Lee Allen, I'm completely okay with that.
You just mentioned that there are some people out there who insist that the Zodiac had a background in draftsmanship, technical drawing, and maybe a similar discipline. Do you think that that type of background will be necessary to create something like the Zodiac Killer ciphers?
No, I've personally made substitution ciphers, and all that you really need is some sort of light table or similar device, some graph paper, what appears to have been 5mm graph paper. It's the most common graph paper in America that I know of. And I also want to bring people's attention to some instruments that we had when I was in school as a child. There were these overhead projectors where the teacher would put a transparency on that, and then you could project that image onto the wall and then write. It would also function as a light table. And so, hypothetically speaking, if the Zodiac Killer had a classroom or access to a classroom, he would have had access to every single tool and implement that he would need to draft, create, and publish the 408, 340, and the 32 and 13 ciphers.
Do you believe that the ciphers, such as the Z13 or the Z32, will ever be solved?
No, I don't think that these ciphers are complicated or complex enough to verify solutions, as many have talked about. The 13 especially is very, very short. I think even if you do have the solution, it would be impossible to scientifically prove that you have the solution. And I think at this point, especially you mentioned the 32. The 32 is not only a cryptographical challenge to investigators, but it's a geographic challenge too. So I think at this point, the Zodiac is trying to waste as much investigative resources and effort as he possibly can. And in doing so, he can say, here's a cipher, this reveals the location of a bomb. And so now you have what is essentially an uncrackable or very, very difficult and complicated to prove cipher, but you've now coupled it with a geographic search area that's now going to have law enforcement digging up the sides of roads, trying to map things out. It's just, I think it was mostly misdirection.
I have a big question for you about that in regards to the Z32, because you've mentioned the bus bomb multiple times. The Z32 cipher also talks about the location of a bomb. Do you believe the Zodiac Killer's bomb was real, or was it a pure prank or a lie?
Maybe it was something he tinkered with. I think after the time he murdered Stein, he was in what many would describe as a mania or kind of on a adrenaline high at this point. I think he was getting bold, ambitious, and otherwise snapping from reality in many ways, or at least snapping from rational, sane thought. And so he might have tinkered with bombs. And we actually see between the bust bomb letter and then whatever letter contains the next bomb diagram, I don't remember which one it was, there appears to be an evolution in that bomb design between those two letters. And this would indicate that his knowledge of explosives was not only limited, but that it was something based on practical experience. His bomb diagram does not really describe a detonator. It doesn't describe a primary explosive. It doesn't describe really a housing. He just says, take certain bags of ammonium nitrate and then dump a few bags of gravel on top or whatever he says. But it doesn't describe electric blasting detonators. It doesn't describe a primary explosive. It doesn't really appear to check out. And I don't want to get too much into Allen's bombs and everything, but if we look at the bombs that were seized from Allen's house too, we see a very rudimentary and novice understanding of bomb making too.
So you've mentioned in this interview that you think the final Zodiac crime was the murder of Paul Stein, because you said that you think only the canonical Zodiac crimes were that of the Zodiac Killer. But when do you think the final Zodiac letter was written?
I would probably, now I don't know what came first, Badlands or the Exorcist letter, but I made a video a couple months back that was inspired by a video you did called The Badlands Card Was Written by the Zodiac Killer. I am pretty much 99 point something percent sure that the Badlands is written by the same person that wrote the debut letter. The Exorcist letter is 74. I don't believe that the 1978 letter was a Zodiac, and of course that caused some controversy early on in my video uploading spree. But
yeah,
I would say probably 74.
And to answer your question, the Exorcist letter came first. And yes, I also think there's a very high chance the Badlands card could be that of the Zodiac Killer. But we have two other letters that came in 1974, the Count Marco letter and the SLA letter. Do you think that those were the Zodiac?
They look weird. And what's interesting about the Count Marco letter is that if that's a Zodiac communication, we have to look at Count Marco's name, Marco Spinelli. And it's possible that he was giving a subtle nod to Ralph Spinelli, who we talked about earlier in this interview, in writing to Count Marco. But I don't know for sure, and I haven't put too much research effort into those letters because they're not really claimed Zodiac communications. They're just kind of psycho letters that came. It's possible, though.
So does this mean that you think everything after 1974 was just a hoax, like the 86, 87 letters, the 1990 Eureka card, the 2001 card, all of those are hoaxes?
Probably. By this time, the Zodiac is already basically internationally famous, or at least nationally famous or infamous. And I think he might have been doing some serious self-reflection following both the Stein incident and his coming to law, or Alan's coming to law enforcement attention in 71, if it's Alan. And he probably had a compulsion, I think, to write to the police or write to the newspapers. There was probably an addictive aspect to that. He probably got some sort of thrill or, a rush out of doing that. But it's interesting that the Badlands card and the Exorcist letter don't appear to be signed by Zodiac. They're either a citizen in the Badlands and yours truly in the Exorcist. And it almost appears to me like a paranoid, standoffish Zodiac writing to the press out of a compulsion to write, but still exercising some caution as to calling himself the Zodiac.
Now, you just mentioned Arthur Lee Allen coming on the radar in 1971. After 71, we have a halt in Zodiac activity for 1972 and 73. Then the Zodiac would allegedly resurface in 1974 with the Exorcist letter, and as you stated, possibly the Badlands card. Why the halt in Zodiac activity?
That's definitely very interesting. Now, hypothetically speaking, if Alan's a Zodiac, he now has Inspector Toschi, Bill Armstrong, the entirety of the SFPD, essentially harassing him or otherwise investigating him all the time. And I think tomorrow, if we were to find out that Alan were the Zodiac, this would make perfect sense because, imagine, if you're a homicidal madman that's writing to the press, you might get a little paranoid too if the police start showing up asking for your handwriting.
Okay, certainly. I follow what you're saying. But we've had the opportunity to talk about the activities of 1971, 1974. But one crime we have not talked about in this interview is the 1966 murder of Sherry Jo Bates. Now, you've already stated that you only believe the Zodiac operated in 1968 and 69 when it came to committing murders. What are your thoughts on the Sherry Jo Bates murder?
I don't think that's a Zodiac crime. I could be wrong, of course, but I think there's a couple of indicators that it's not a Zodiac crime. One is that if the confession letter was written by the killer of Sherry Jo Bates, which is what the police believe, personally and subjectively, I don't think that those linguistics line up with the debut linguistics and with the, the three-part letters and stuff like that. Of course, that was done with a typewriter versus handwriting. And then in the Sherry Jo Bates murder, we also see a finishing maneuver from the offender. The offender has not only stabbed Sherry Jo Bates a number of times, but he also slit her throat. And if that's the same offender as the person who did the Berryessa crime, then why does the Berryessa homicide not include this type of a finishing maneuver to ensure the death of the victim prior to his escape from the crime scene?
Well, I guess it's all part of the mystery. But some people believe that maybe the Zodiac killer didn't murder Sherry Joe Bates, but he wrote some of the letters or communications, because we also have the desktop poem, that he wrote some of these letters and communications after the Bates murder. What do you think about that?
Um, I I don't know, because I worry that some people are trying to push a Ross Sullivan narrative or push a certain narrative in saying some of these things, and not a lot of times they're not forthright about exactly what their intentions are behind making these claims. It's a possibility, but there are a number of indicators from the Sherry Joe Bates crime that don't appear to be the same offender. He has this complex and up close interaction with Sherry Joe Bates. He walks her away from the initial encounter site into another area before committing his crime. He commits a knife crime and he ensures it with a finishing maneuver. Um, it's possible Zodiac did the Riverside situation. I haven't so far seen much powerful or compelling proof that he either did that or wrote those letters in the aftermath. It's, it could be, but a lot of that is really based on, the opinions of Sherwood Morrill, and I don't consider Sherwood Morrill to be a credible or reliable assessor of handwriting analysis.
Well, then what do you make of the Zodiac killer writing in a letter, which almost everyone accepts to be confirmed, that I give you credit for stumbling upon my Riverside activity, but you're only getting the easy ones. There are a hell of a lot more down there. What do you think about that? Does that not indicate that he had something to do with the Bates murder or the letters?
Well, he didn't write that until after that connection was postulated. And so if that's him, it shows a significant deviation from normal Zodiac behavior where he announces information that has yet to be released. And it also seems to reflect this already hypothesized desire to misdirect law enforcement resources. If he can trick them into thinking that he's done this crime down in Riverside, now he has not only law enforcement looking down in Riverside, but he also has law enforcement saying, okay, well, this is the offender down here and this is the offender up here. Then anything that is outside of that hypothesis, say he's a guy that can't be placed in Riverside. Well, then when they start looking at him, they might rule him out going, well, he can't be placed in Riverside, so therefore this guy can't be the Zodiac. And so that's a very dangerous predicament to find ourselves in. It's much like with the Kathleen Johns situation. Zodiac really didn't provide any insider information, and he also didn't really provide any information about that event until after it was already speculated by the press.
Okay, so we can talk about Kathleen Johns in just a second, but I do want to get a particular follow-up. Does this mean that you don't think the Zodiac killer wrote the Riverside Confession, the desktop poem, or the Bates Had to Die letters? Any of those were not Zodiac? Or all of those were Zodiac? Okay.
Probably not, but the Bates Had to Die is interesting because it features excess postage. The envelope looks quite a bit like a Zodiac envelope. But I think if you dig up enough murder cases and you start trying to look for little things that line up and disregard everything else, you might be surprised at how many things you could speculate were committed by the Zodiac killer.
All right, very good. But you mentioned the Kathleen Johns incident, and this is one of the most famous unconfirmed Zodiac crimes. March 22nd of 1970, when somebody told Kathleen Johns that her back wheel was wobbling on her car to pull over, and he said he was going to tighten it for her, but he was actually loosening it, and then it fell off, and he says, oh, I guess it's worse than I thought. He's giving her a ride to a service station, but really it's an attempted abduction. Long story short, reportedly she's able to get away. What do you think happened with that incident?
Drew Beeson's been pretty loud about this, saying that he has some kind of insider or background information that Kathleen Johns either completely fabricated or partially fabricated aspects of this incident. And basically the reason that this was first tied to Zodiac is that when Kathleen Johns was brought in for questioning at the police station in the aftermath of this incident, she took a look at the Presidio Heights composite sketch and said, that's him, that's the man that kidnapped me. And this kind of started this avalanching effect of people speculating that Kathleen Johns is a Zodiac crime. And then it was made worse when Don Chaney came forward later and talked about how Alan told him about this scheme to loosen lug nuts and do all this. But this really in fact, this crime seems to rely on the idea that the Presidio Heights composite is accurate enough for Kathleen Johns to make that identification. And then it also ignores the fact that Zodiac didn't really claim responsibility for it until after it was speculated in the press. And then there's some issues supposedly with, the scene of the event. According to, I believe Ross Geraci said this, but I know he was talking with a couple people on the Planet X Filmworks channel, that when that car was found, all of the wheels were still connected to the car. And this would contradict her story that the wheel completely fell off the car. I don't know Kathleen Johns' exact motivation, but I'm very skeptical of the idea that Zodiac would do a crime this way when, by all previous indicators, he likes to show up, kill people as fast as he can for the most part, and then leave as fast as he can. He doesn't appear to be driving around with people for hours at a time and saying creepy things, although, Paul Stine is the closest you get to that, where he's in a cab with the victim. But yeah, I'm real skeptical of all these non-canonicals, and I think if we're going to be tying crimes together, we should be doing it with very solid and logical, undeniable ballistics and forensics.
On that note, Vincent, you have shared a lot of opinions on your channel, New Coach 2024, and you don't seem to mind challenging people. So may I ask, what is the most ridiculous Zodiac theory you've ever heard?
Probably that Zodiac was DB Cooper.
And why is that?
That just goes against everything that the witnesses on the flight crew said about DB Cooper. It really doesn't. It's a little crazy to me to think that this guy, engages in this prolific murder spree, and then he goes and hijacks an airplane and jumps out. And of course, DB Cooper is described as a swarthy middle-aged man with darker skin. I think it's probably a sensationalized attempt at making a colorful narrative up.
Fascinating. And Vincent, right now I would like to give you the floor. Do you have any final concluding message for the listeners of Black Box Online Radio? Where can people find your stuff? What do you have in the works? And anything you'd like to share with the listeners of BBOR?
Yeah, first and foremost, I hope that people can take a step back from these speculative hypothetical routes and start really reviewing the evidence itself. It's important, I think, not to arrive at a conclusion, say, I think this guy's the Zodiac, and then make a bunch of coincidences to fit him. It's much better if we start from the ground level, we start from scratch, we compile and say, what evidence do we actually have? What do we really know here? And where can that lead us? And I also really want to push for a release of more evidence, a release of more information from the SFPD. I think they've been, in my personal opinion, inexcusably tight-lipped about this situation. I don't see too many advantages of having so much holdback evidence at this point after all this time. And I really just hope people can start seeing things a little more scientifically. I mean, we can be conducting these experiments. Until I did Operation Airplane Cement, I didn't see anyone, and I'm not saying I'm the first person to do it, because I'm sure that the experiment has been conducted, but I didn't see anybody doing these things. Like, let's put airplane cement on our fingers and see how likely is this claim. Let's tape a flashlight to a J.C. Higgins Model 80 and discharge a bunch of ammunition and see what happens. Like, we should be conducting real-world science to ascertain what information is legitimate, what things line up with the facts and the crime scene evidence, and what can that evidence tell us. And we should also be, as a community, getting a little louder towards declassification of the holdback and maybe kind of encouraging a public movement towards identification of the Zodiac, because in this Golden State Killer case, what happened when people started getting pretty motivated is we caught the son of a gun. So I'm hoping that we can start making a little bit more of a stir on Zodiac. I do believe that this is a solvable case. But we're going to have to kind of overhaul the way that we're looking at the case. Instead of playing true crime fantasy football or true crime speculation road, we should be really taking a look and compiling things and saying, what do we have? What do we know? And what can we do so that law enforcement can either assist us or provide us some more data so that we can solve or otherwise obtain a clearer picture of this case?
And the final question for you, Vincent, is why did you choose to name your YouTube channel New Cokes 2024?
It's based on the title of my album and that I released at that time. And I guess in that moment, I was kind of gearing up to release that record. And it just seemed like, when you check out like a music artist or something and it'll say like something official. And so I just went with that. And then, of course, started making a lot of waves in the Zodiac world. And by the time I had you and everybody else referring to me as that, I just kept it. And I haven't been, because it's not for me so much about publicity and pride as it is just the content, the logic, and the ideas. And this case is not about me. It's not about my reputation. It's not about my image. It's not about how much money I can make selling you a book or an idea. It's about solving real murders. People tend to lose sight of that. There are individuals who were killed. There are individuals whose lives were turned upside down and destroyed by this case. And there are now, to this day, individuals that are exploiting that to try to make money or to try to push their own personal image. And I'm just not a fan of that. And I hope that I can keep myself from ever engaging in something like that.
And Vincent McConnell, thank you so much.
Thanks, Ned.
And once again, I would like to thank Vincent McConnell for being a guest on Black Box Online Radio. And right now, I would like to turn it over to you guys. What do you think about Arthur Lee Allen as a Zodiac killer suspect? Please put your ideas in the comments section down below. And you can always contact me at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. On Facebook, my personal Facebook is Ned Dahan, and there's always BlackboxNed88 on Instagram. And you can always download this show for free on Spotify. And I will see you guys on the panel discussion show on Mysteries with Mr. Belgique. That's all for me. Goodbye.